Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we've got, well, quite a collection of sources, research papers, articles, some really deep theoretical stuff. And they don't just ask us to maybe tweak how we see addiction. No, they fundamentally challenge, the whole operating system of modern mental health.
They really do.
So our mission here is to take these, frankly, quite radical ideas about trauma, healing, the unconscious, and really distill them down into something clear, actionable, something you can really grasp.
Exactly. And this is foundational stuff we're diving into. We're unpacking this core idea, this thesis that addiction, it's not primarily a disease in itself.
Right, not a moral failing either.
Not a moral failing, not a lack of willpower. It's fundamentally a symptom, a conditioned survival response, really, to trauma that hasn't been resolved, to overwhelming stress.
Okay, let's unpack that because, wow, that shifts the whole game, doesn't it?
It does.
The sources bring in this thing called the addiction as dissociation model, or ADM. And it defines addiction as, well, as a strong conditioned bond. But a bond to what? To a dissociative state of being.
Precisely. And the key thing here, the purpose of that bond, isn't self-destruction, weirdly enough. It's purely pragmatic.
Pragmatic, how so?
It's about ensuring survival, psychological, physical survival, regulation, by any means necessary, whatever gets the system through the perceived threat.
Okay, so if we accept that, just for a moment, that addiction is bonded to dissociation for survival, then addiction memory must be like basically the same kind of memory as traumatic memory, right?
Exactly. That's the direct link. Which means if you follow the logic, the symptoms of addiction should look almost identical to traumatic stress symptoms.
Like PTSD symptoms.
PTSD, complex trauma, dissociative stuff. Because, according to this model, they spring from the exact same root. The body's safety system getting totally overwhelmed.
We definitely need to define dissociation clearly here. Because, most people think it's just spacing out, daydreaming.
Right, but the sources are much clearer. They say it's way more fundamental. Literally, the word means to sever, to separate from, or to live independently from.
Okay.
And they frame it not as a disorder, primarily, but as a critical biological safety valve. It's necessary when an experience is just too much, too fast, too overwhelming for the conscious mind to process.
Like a circuit breaker in your house.
That's a great analogy, yeah. The system detects a potential threat, maybe existential, and click. Dissociation kicks in. It conserves energy, lets you assess the danger, protects the core self.
So it allows for a kind of psychological split.
Exactly. The conscious mind can sort of keep going, appear normal, while the deeper system, the body, deals with the overwhelming input. It's ancient, this mechanism, in all biological life, really.
Which leads us to, I found this the most mind-bending idea in all the source material. They state it pretty plainly. The physical body is the psychological unconscious.
Yeah. That's a big one. It sounds philosophical, but they argue it has huge practical implications.
So no more mind-body split.
Well, it resolves that debate, doesn't it? It says emotional truth, past experiences aren't just floating around in our thoughts. They're literally encoded in the body.
How? Like where?
In muscle tension, in the patterns of your autonomic nervous system, your gut feelings, implicit memory systems. The body remembers things the conscious mind has forgotten, or maybe even deliberately walled off.
Okay, wow. So if the body is the hard drive holding those memories, you can't just talk your way out of a body problem, can you? If the unconscious is running the show from, like, your muscles and nerves.
Precisely. That's the point. The unconscious, by definition, isn't operating on rational argument. It's operating on survival logic stored in the body.
So my conscious brain might be saying, stop doing this thing.
Right. Your cognitive self wants to stop. But the physical body, acting as the unconscious, is basically driving the car, repeating an action that, at some point in the past, felt like it guaranteed survival. Willpower doesn't stand much of a chance against that deep physical imperative.
That makes sense. Okay, let's talk about how universal this mechanism really is then. If dissociation is biological, just part of being alive,
then addiction simply means getting, well, pathologically stuck or dependent on that natural dissociative process, using it to survive the present moment, even when the original danger is gone.
Right. And this is where the idea of a spectrum comes in, isn't it?
Exactly. Trauma or intense stress kicks off that predictable dissociation process. Neurobiologically, we can see it. Think of the dorsal vagal response.
The freeze response.
Yeah, the ultimate freeze. Body goes limp, heart rate plummets, metabolism slows right down. Maximum shutdown, designed purely for survival when fight or flight aren't options.
But that's meant to be temporary, right? Like a pause before you either heal or get moving again.
Ideally, yes.
Hmm.
But addiction creeps in when the person gets pathologically bonded, not to the process itself, but to the outcome of that dissociation.
What kind of outcomes?
It could be anything the brain links to survival. Maybe the substance or behavior produces pleasure, a reward signal. Or maybe it brings safety, numbness, escape from pain, or even just a state of idle rest and repair when the system is totally burnt out. The brain learns this state is survival, and the addiction becomes the shortcut.
A shortcut to regulating a system that feels completely out of control otherwise.
That's it. And this framing is so much more inclusive than the standard medical view, isn't it?
Absolutely. It feels bigger. The sources use this analogy. They say addiction, dissociation, trauma. They're not totally separate things. They're like phases of water.
Yeah, ice, water, steam, all H2O, just different states depending on the conditions.
So these are just different manifestations of the same core human experience, how we respond when we're overwhelmed.
Exactly. It's a normed experience, they argue. It only differs by degree, by severity, by duration, which means, well, it means anyone, given the right cocktail of stress and trauma, has the biological capacity to develop an addictive survival bond.
It's not some freak condition only some people get. It's fundamentally human.
Fundamentally human, which, if you think about it, should really help reduce the stigma, right? If it's part of our shared biology.
Usually. And we see this play out, this internal split in some of the research cited. There was a phenomenological study looking at the actual lived experience of active addiction.
Ah, yes, that study is critical.
Yeah.
Because it really gives voice to that internal division, that feeling of being split. It identifies two distinct parts of the self operating during active addiction.
Okay, what are they?
They call them the ANP, the appearing normal part, and the EP, the emotional part.
ANP, appearing normal. That sounds like the part that, holds down a job, pays the bills, smiles at the neighbors, the conscious, rational bit.
That's exactly it. The ANP is the cognitive self, trying to maintain function, aware of the consequences, feeling the shame, the guilt. And when researchers interviewed that part, the ANP...
What did it say?
It described addiction in really horrific terms. Feeling enslaved, imprisoned, tortured, totally out of control, like there was a creature inside, driving the bus, just watching the body destroy itself. Helpless.
That powerlessness again, that deficit of choice we talked about.
But here's the kicker. The study also captured the experience of the other part, the EP, the emotional part.
And what did that part say? Because it can't be the same experience, can it?
Totally different. When the EP is in the driver's seat, especially, say, right before using or while under the influence, it reports benefits, profound ones.
Benefits, like what?
Improved functioning sometimes, pain relief, definitely. But even more, it experiences the state of active addiction as freedom, happiness even.
Freedom. How can it be freedom when the ANP feels enslaved?
Because for the EP, the survival-oriented emotional part, that state is regulation. It's the moment the internal chaos stops, the overwhelming feelings numb out, the system feels temporarily safe, maybe even powerful. For the EP, it's a peak experience that feels essential for survival.
Wow. So one part feels trapped, the other feels liberated, at the same time in the same person.
Exactly. And that deep fundamental conflict explains so much, doesn't it? Why relapse happens, why people persist despite devastating consequences. The decision to use, ultimately, is often made by the EP, the part that genuinely believes this behavior is life-affirming or life-saving.
It overrides the rational arguments of the ANP.
Completely, because the EP operates on a much deeper, non-verbal, survival-based logic.
So the underlying driver, the implicit goal, isn't self-destruction then?
No, the sources argue the implicit goal is repair. Unresolved trauma leaves these dissociative after effects, this fragmentation, and the body, with its own kind of intelligence, tries to heal or complete that experience, often through reenactment.
Trying to get back to that peak experience of safety the EP remembers.
Or trying to process the original overwhelming event in some way. Active addiction from this perspective is driven by that unconscious lived experience of the EP trying to find resolution or regulation.
The EP is basically saying, look, this worked before when things were impossible. It made me feel okay, or at least less bad. So, must be the answer now.
Pretty much. This saved me once, maybe it'll save me again. And if that decision is happening way down deep in the body's survival memory...
then we need a way to actually get in there and update that memory, right? We can't just talk at it.
Exactly. Which brings us right to the healing mechanism the sources focus on. Memory reconsolidation.
Okay. Memory reconsolidation. What is that in simple terms?
Think of it as the brain's natural software update process for emotional memories. It's adaptive memory reorganization. It allows you to open an old memory file, effectively rewrite the emotional charge attached to it, and then save the updated version.
So you don't forget what happened.
No, you don't forget the facts. You keep the lesson, the information, but you let go of the painful emotional load, the activation, the feeling that it's still happening now.
You keep the lesson, lose the charge. I like that. And this is what some models call adaptive resolution.
Yes, like the adaptive information processing model used in EMDR, it leads to an updated point of view, integrating the past into the present in a healthy way.
Okay, but how do we actually trigger this update process? How do we open the memory file for editing?
That requires what the sources call a specific mechanism of action, a MOA. And the key thing this MOA needs to do is create something called a dual attention state, or DAS.
Dual attention state. Okay, sounds technical. What is it?
It's simpler than it sounds. It just means being able to be here and there at the same time, mentally holding awareness of the present moment's safety here and now, while also accessing the memory or feeling from the past.
Like having one foot in the present and one foot in the past.
Exactly. And that dual focus is crucial for Mr. R. It creates the necessary contrast.
Contrast between what?
Between the old, learning the maladaptive beliefs stored in the memory, like I'm unsafe, or I need this substance to cope, and the new information available in the present, like I am safe now, or I have other coping skills.
And it's that difference, that mismatch, that tells the brain the old file needs updating.
Precisely. Neuroscientists call it a prediction error. The brain predicts threat based on the old memory, but the present reality contradicts it. That contradiction makes the original memory trace labile open to change for a short window. And if the new adaptive information is present during that window, the memory gets reconsolidated, updated.
Okay, that makes sense. The brain updates its software when it gets conflicting data.
That's a good way to put it. The emotional charge gets released, the memory gets recoded with the new perspective.
Now, here's what I found really fascinating. The sources argue that these mechanisms of action, the things that create this dual attention state, they're not some weird complex therapy technique necessarily.
Not at all. They argue they're universal, common. Things people do every single day, often completely unintentionally, that accidentally trigger healing.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Okay, think about just going for a walk or a run. The bilateral movement, left, right, naturally creates a form of dual attention, a bit like EMDR's eye movements.
Seriously? Just walking?
Potentially, yes, especially if you're processing something emotionally while doing it. Playing a musical instrument requires intense focus here and now, but can allow emotions or memories to surface simultaneously.
Okay, who else?
Even just talking things out loud, it engages one part of the brain while letting other stuff process. Having background music or noise can do it occupies one channel, frees up another. Mindfully staring or gazing at a fixed point.
That sounds like brain spotting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the core mechanism of brain spotting, creating art. Even silence, if used mindfully, can allow that dual state. Anything that achieves that balance of present moment anchor while allowing past material to surface can potentially facilitate emetaa.
So you're saying that the body or maybe the unconscious mind kind of naturally seeks out these states. People stumble into healing without even realizing the mechanism?
It really seems that way. It points to an intrinsic drive towards self-healing, using these readily available everyday MOAs. The sources even mention things like getting sick or feeling disoriented.
How does being sick help?
Well, think about it. Illness often forces humility, introspection, a break from the usual patterns. It can create a space for reflection, for things to surface. Disorientation can shake up rigid perspectives. It's like you have to get sick to get well, get disoriented to find a new orientation. It fosters character change.
That's profound. It really democratizes healing, doesn't it? Makes it less reliant on expensive therapies.
It certainly suggests the capacity for healing is built into us, which provides a perfect bridge, really, to why certain modern treatments are showing such promise.
New like psychedelic therapy,
Yeah.
PT, which the FDA has given breakthrough status for PTSD.
Exactly. From this perspective, PT isn't magic. It's simply a very powerful, intentionally applied mechanism of action.
How does it work as an OA?
The medicine itself helps create that crucial dual attention state. It does a couple of key things neurobiologically. First, it tends to decrease activity in the default mode network, the DMN.
The DMN. Remind us what that is. I sometimes think of it as the brain's ego or self-critic network.
That's a good way to think about it. It's involved in self-referential thought, mind wandering, worrying about the past or future, maintaining our rigid stories about ourselves, our internal radio station of anxieties, maybe.
Okay, so psychedelics quiet that down.
They tend to, yeah. By quieting that default chatter, the system kind of loosens its cognitive grip. And simultaneously, the sources say psychedelics help to thin what they call the amnesia barrier.
The amnesia barrier.
Yeah.
Like the wall between the conscious and unconscious.
Pretty much. That veil that keeps all that stored body memory, the unconscious material, separate from our everyday awareness. So the DMN quiets down, the barrier thins.
And the stored stuff can surface.
Exactly. The deep-seated emotional material, the body memories, can finally come up to be processed. But without the usual filter of the rational mind immediately trying to analyze, suppress, or judge it. And critically, often with a sense of connection or safety provided by the therapeutic setting.
Providing that necessary contrast for reconsolidation. The past material meets present safety.
Precisely. But this brings up a crucial point about interpretation.
Which is?
If the person having this experience hasn't been taught that the body is the unconscious, that memory is stored somatically, how do they make sense of these images, sensations, feelings that suddenly surface?
You might think they're just random hallucinations.
Exactly. The unconscious communicates nonverbally through images, sounds, replays of sensory data, strong emotions. It's the language of the body. If you don't have a framework for that, if you can't recognize it as your own unprocessed history speaking...
You label it a hallucination, pathologize it, maybe get scared by it.
Right. When it might actually be the very material that needs to surface for healing. It's memory, not madness, trying to communicate.
The sources even loop cannabis into this framework, don't they?
They do. They point out that THC often induces alpha brainwaves.
And alpha waves are linked too.
Focused attention, mindfulness, relaxation, a state conducive to that kind of dual awareness. So they argue cannabis, for many, can function as a kind of mild, everyday psychedelic, potentially providing a subtle form of DAS for processing.
And this connects back to the body's own systems.
Absolutely. The body naturally uses its endocannabinoid system, ECS, and its endogenous opioid system, EOS, its internal cannabis and opioid systems in regulating stress, dissociation, and even addiction formation.
So when external substances like cannabis or even psychedelics activate these same systems.
It suggests PT isn't introducing something totally alien. It's engaging with, maybe amplifying, the body's own innate ancient pathways for managing stress and potentially healing trauma. The body already knows this language.
Okay, this addiction is dissociation model, the ADM, it's incredibly comprehensive. It gives us a new definition, connects it to trauma, outlines a healing mechanism.
But it doesn't stop there.
No. It uses this foundation to launch a pretty sharp critique of our current mental health system, how we diagnose, how we treat.
Yeah, the sources argue that psychology and the standard medical model are often operating outside their actual scope of competence when it comes to these deeper issues.
What issues specifically?
Things like the existential nature of stress, the reality of addiction as dissociation, the importance of moral development, and the whole complex issue around reintroducing psychedelics. They argue the current systems are structurally ill-equipped.
And one of the main criticisms focuses on diagnosis, right? The DSM.
Yes. A major point is the incompleteness of current definitions, since those core dissociative symptoms, the splitting, the numbness, the AM-PEP dynamic we talked about, aren't directly captured or measured in a standard addiction diagnosis.
Then the diagnosis is missing the root cause.
It's diagnosing the smoke alarm without looking for the fire. It sees the substance use, but misses the underlying dissociation that's fueling it. And think about this. The sources highlight that major categories like addiction and even depression are not currently classified as trauma and stress-related disorders in the DSM.
Wait, really? Even though the link seems so clear, especially with this model?
Right. Despite the overwhelming evidence of stress system involvement, they live in different chapters of the book, so to speak, which has real-world consequences for treatment and understanding.
That seems like a huge oversight. If trauma is the root, shouldn't they be categorized together?
You'd think so. But it leads to this diagnostic dilemma. The system, partly for billing and insurance reasons, often ends up pathologizing what the sources call normed distress.
Meaning normal human reactions to abnormal situations.
Exactly. Universal stress responses get labeled as individual disorders, and the implicit message of getting a diagnosis like major depressive disorder or substance use disorder can be really powerful, right? It can feel like a life sentence, a fixed identity, rather than a description of a temporary survival state.
Yet frames it as what you are, instead of what you're experiencing.
And consider the stats. Big studies on adverse childhood experiences, the ACE study, show epidemic levels of early trauma. Logically, dissociation should be widespread.
But diagnoses of actual dissociative disorders are pretty rare clinically.
Right. Why? The sources argue it's because the distress is manifesting and being diagnosed primarily as addiction or depression, because we're not looking for the dissociative features systematically. The presentations are misclassified.
Which leads straight into another major critique. The idea of the missing addictions.
Yes, the process addictions.
Behaviors, not substances. The sources argue these are basically ignored. Why?
Well, the argument is it's convenient, especially for those in power. These behaviors often lack the same kind of immediate quantifiable scrutiny as, say, illegal drug use. They're harder to measure, easier to overlook, or even approve of.
Okay, so what specific missing addictions do they propose should actually be in the DSM?
They single out three big ones: perfectionism, altruism, and ambition.
Whoa. Okay, perfectionism I can maybe see.
Yeah.
But altruism, ambition, aren't those good things? How can they be addictions?
Again, it comes down to the function they serve for the person's internal system, for regulating that underlying dissociation or trauma. When these behaviors stop being flexible choices and become rigid, compulsive, required for feeling okay or worthy.
They become survival tools,
Yeah.
driven by that emotional part, the EP.
Exactly. They become the substance. Let's take perfectionism. What's the function? It's often an addiction to control and a desperate attempt to avoid shame or criticism.
If I'm perfect, no one can hurt me.
Right. The high is that temporary, fleeting feeling of safety, of being beyond reproach. But it's a trap because perfection is impossible. So the pursuit becomes relentless, the crash is devastating when failure inevitably occurs, and that just fuels more need for the fix of striving for perfection. It's a dissociative shield against vulnerability.
Okay, I can see that. What about altruism, helping others?
It becomes pathological, an addiction, when the person needs to constantly serve others to feel any sense of self-worth, or, critically, to dissociate from their own pain, their own unmet needs.
So, focusing entirely outward to avoid looking inward.
Precisely. The high is feeling needed, indispensable, maybe morally superior. The EP uses this constant external focus to regulate the internal chaos. It's an addiction to being the rescuer, which conveniently allows the person to avoid ever being vulnerable or addressing their own wounds.
And ambition.
Yeah.
The engine of capitalism, right?
Well, when it becomes an addiction, it's the relentless pursuit of external validation status, power, money, achievements, purely as a means of feeling safe, in control, or enough.
The fix is the next promotion, the next deal, the next public recognition.
Exactly. It's an endless treadmill. And the sources argue this one is particularly dangerous and insidious because society actively rewards it. The system celebrates addictive ambition, especially in leaders, which is exactly why, they argue, the system has zero interest in diagnosing it as a pathology. It would undermine the whole structure.
Which brings us to their critique of the systems themselves. Law, medicine, psychology. They argue these institutions exhibit their own professional addictions.
No, absolutely. A core argument is that these systems are deeply addicted to maintaining power, control, and the status quo.
Why? What would they lose?
Admitting failure, acknowledging the role of trauma and dissociation as central, recognizing the potential of psychedelics. Doing that would require a fundamental shift in power, resources, and established practices. It would mean admitting the old ways were incomplete, maybe even harmful.
And that systemic addiction to control hinders real progress.
Fundamentally, it prevents moral development within the system, prevents necessary change, keeps the focus on symptoms rather than root causes. It protects the system's own equilibrium, even if it harms individuals.
This reveals a really interesting philosophical split. They talk about the problem with relying only on quantitative science.
Right. They characterize purely quantitative reasoning as linear, logical, reductionistic. Sometimes they label it male reasoning, not necessarily meaning gender, but a style of thought.
Focused on data points, cause and effect, breaking things down.
Yes, which is incredibly useful for some things, obviously, but it often misses the bigger picture, the emotional context, the qualitative reality, the interconnectedness of human experience. It sees the individual trees, but misses the health of the whole forest.
And this is where they introduce that very provocative idea of moral math.
Yes, the idea that sometimes, qualitatively, 1 + 1 = 3.
Okay, explain that. How can 1 + 1 = 3?
It's a metaphor, of course. It illustrates that in complex living systems, like a human being, a relationship, a community, The whole is often greater than the sum of its parts. When two people connect, 1 plus 1, something new emerges. The three, the relationship itself, the shared understanding, the emotional field between them.
Synergy, the emergent property.
Exactly. Purely linear quantitative thinking struggles to account for that qualitative value, that emergent third. It only sees the two separate ones. Qualitative reasoning, emotional logic, intuitive knowing that's needed to grasp the three.
And if our legal and medical systems rely almost exclusively on that linear quantitative model,
They miss the reality of human suffering, the impact of relational trauma, the importance of collective experience. They make decisions based on incomplete data.
the sources argue laws themselves aren't objective then.
Not truly objective, no. They argue laws are ultimately subjective constructs. They arise from the lived experience, the values, the precedents of the dominant culture at a particular time. They reflect that group's reality, which isn't necessarily shared, accurate, or just.
And the prime example they use is the war on drugs.
Yes. Cited as a clear case of policy driven not by science or compassion, but by prejudice, political gain, and social control. A successful act of systemic abuse, they call it, rooted in the system's own pathology and addiction to control, causing immense harm.
Okay, so if the system itself is potentially addicted and operating on incomplete logic, what's the counterforce?
The sources propose reviving an ancient yet newly relevant concept, the role of the healer.
The healer. Not therapist, not doctor, but healer.
Yes, positioned explicitly as a necessary check and balance against what they see as the industrialized pathology of modern healthcare systems.
How is a healer different? What defines them?
It's not primarily about licenses or degrees, though they might have those. It's defined as a vocation, a calling. A healer is someone who has deeply integrated their work into their being. Crucially, they are grounded in their own lived experience of dissociation, trauma, and recovery.
The path of the wounded healer.
Exactly. They offer wisdom and moral fortitude that comes from having navigated those life and death struggles themselves. They've faced the abyss and come back.
So the core difference between, say, a healer and a therapist isn't just the name.
No, it's fundamental to the approach. Therapy, as critiqued by these sources, can sometimes become just a job, something done to or on a client, often constrained by legal frameworks, insurance rules, business models.
Whereas a healer,
works with the client. They are in states of healing alongside the person. It's framed as a mutual spiritual journey, operating with a different kind of ethical compass, often outside the standard institutional constraints that prioritize liability or profit over deep transformative work.
this mention of ethics brings us to another key concept, moral ethics, which sounds a bit redundant, but they make a distinction.
They do. It's a crucial distinction. Moral ethics isn't just about following the rules, the professional code of ethics, or the law. It actually requires professionals at times to morally break those codes or laws.
Break the rules when?
When those rules or laws clearly perpetuate harm, injustice, or stand in the way of necessary healing, when advocating against clear system failures.
So the difference between standard ethics and this idea of moral ethics is
Action and
Or-
courage. Standard ethics, the sources argue, often prioritize social order, conformity, avoiding liability. They don't necessarily demand authenticity or bravery. Morality, however, does. It requires acting in alignment with deeper principles, even when it's risky or goes against the grain.
Can you give a concrete example? When would moral ethics demand rule breaking?
Well, they cite the opioid crisis. Professionals becoming aware that supposedly non-addictive opiates were, in fact, highly dangerous and addictive. Moral ethics would have demanded they speak out, whistleblow, actively challenge the system, even if it meant violating confidentiality agreements or facing professional sanctions.
And applying that today?
It means challenging the continued prohibition of psychedelics. If the science increasingly shows clear medical and psychological value, especially for trauma rooted in dissociation, then adhering to laws that criminalize these potential healing tools isn't just unethical in a broader sense, it's immoral according to this framework. It obstructs healing.
Wow. That's a strong stance. It demands active resistance to unjust systems.
Yes, which leads to the call for what they term the recovery reckoning.
A reckoning for whom?
For the institutions, government, medicine, law. They point to the catastrophic failures, the war on drugs, the opioid crisis, maybe even aspects of the COVID-19 response as evidence of deep systemic dysfunction, systemic addiction.
So just like an individual in recovery, the system needs to take step one.
That's exactly the analogy. These bodies need to collectively acknowledge their powerlessness over their own addiction to control, denial, and outdated paradigms. They need to admit the current approach is failing and causing harm.
That's a huge ask for entrenched institutions.
It is, but the sources argue it's necessary. The future requires professionals and the systems they work in to align with core recovery principles. Honesty, humility, making amends, willingness to change, and specifically, the law must evolve to catch up with the science and common sense.
Which right now points towards the therapeutic value of psychedelics for these trauma-related conditions.
Correct. If the law continues to ignore the reality of the body as the unconscious, if it fails to define addiction accurately as trauma-related dissociation, it basically guarantees that our systems will just keep repeating the same mistakes.
Just like an individual stuck in reenactment.
Exactly. The systems become rigid, defensive, unable to adapt, mirroring the very pathology they claim to treat. They end up enacting their own unhealed institutional trauma.
Okay. This has been, well, it's been a really deep dive, Lerner. A lot to process. Let's try and synthesize the absolute core takeaways, the main paradigm shifts here.
All right. 3 big ones stand out. First, the definition. Addiction is fundamentally trauma-related dissociation, a conditioned survival response, not a primary disease or moral failing.
Okay. That shifts everything towards understanding, away from shame. Number 2.
The mind-body connection is resolved, in a sense. The physical body is the psychological unconscious. It holds our history. We need body-based approaches because we can't just think our way out of somatic memory.
Got it. Body is the unconscious.
The third.
Healing isn't mystical. It follows a universal, potentially quantifiable algorithm, memory reconsolidation. And this happens via various mechanisms of action that create a dual attention state.
Which validates existing trauma therapies like EMDR or brain spotting, and provides a clear scientific framework for why psychedelics work. They are powerful MOAs that facilitate DAS by quieting the DMN and thinning that amnesia barrier, allowing the unconscious material to surface and be reconsolidated.
Right, so the path forward, according to these sources, really hinges on embracing this more holistic view, accepting qualitative knowledge, body wisdom, alongside the quantitative.
Yes, and moving past denial, both personal and systemic. Understanding that the patterns we see repeating, whether in our own lives or in our institutions, are often just the past, unhealed, trying desperately to resolve itself through reenactment.
Our systems reflect our collective state of healing, or lack thereof.
Precisely. Which leads to the final thought the sources leave us with. It's quite provocative.
Let's hear it.
They state, quite baldly, if the law were fully mature, psychedelics would not be illegal. So the closing question for you, the listener, builds on that. If our established systems, legal, medical, psychological, might just be enacting their own unhealed traumas, their own addictions to control and denial, then what is the action, grounded in moral ethics, that you need to take today?
However small.
However small. What action do you need to take to stop reinforcing the history, personal or collective, that is simply trying to heal itself through you, through us?
That requires some deep reflection. And maybe some courageous action.
Moral ethics in action.
Exactly. We'll leave you with that thought to ponder, Lerner. That was definitely a deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.